Good morning, I'm Rowena Crosby.
And I'm Deborah Renner, and we're your co-hosts for this show. Thank you for joining us for the next 17 minutes for Your Invisible Toolbox, the show sponsored by Tero International that features the book Row and I co-authored, and every week we look at a tool for working more effectively with others.
And we're delighted to welcome you to our live broadcast today from the Tero International studio here in Des Moines. And those of you who have been watching for a while, you may not know that this is a bit of a makeshift studio. So when we decided to start this program a couple of years ago, we just moved into Deb's office. So she's a nomad walking around with a laptop computer and set up this studio. But last week we signed a lease on expanding our premises here in our learning center, and we're going to be building out a full production video studio. We're really excited about it, and we'd love your feedback. So if you can reflect, especially those of you who've been following us for a while, what do you like about the show, both the set and the format? What changes would you maybe want to recommend? Are there any programs that you watch that you really love the setting that you think could be serve as inspiration for us? We'd love to hear from you.
We really would. It's an exciting time in this show, 2 years in, to be able to build out that space, and there's nothing that we'll value more than to have your suggestions for how to move forward.
Well, most of us have seen the YouTube news bloopers, and this is when the reporter, and we're talking about being on camera, this is when the reporter doesn't realize that the mic or the camera is still running, and they say or do something that's inappropriate. That's usually followed by a grand apology on air and sometimes by a firing.
It does, and they just made an honest mistake, and if they had just acted as if their mic was on, it all could have been avoided.
And of course, it isn't just news reporters, although that's kind of a big public thing. It happens to all of us. We've all been in a situation where we said or did something and it ends up getting us into trouble.
It does. One employee told CNN that he was sharing some negative details about his supervisor to a colleague, not realizing that his supervisor was right behind him in line. She actually dismissed him on the spot.
Now, hopefully you haven't experienced anything quite that severe, but if you do look back on your career, most of us can think of one or two things that we've said that we wish we hadn't said in the workplace.
We've been thinking about those as we've gone through our practice on this script,
exactly.
Actually. And even this person that I'm going to quote, looking back on some things that they may have said or done, might have done things differently. In the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Whenever you are to do a thing, ask yourself how you would act were all the world looking at you, and then act accordingly." Now, that was good advice 200 years ago. It's really relevant today.
It really is. Think about the modern workplace, and think about the cohort entering the workplace. So the millennials have already grown up under these watchful eyes of cameras, recording devices, web cameras, drones. Think about it. Now almost all of us are carrying around a device in our purse or in our pocket that has a camera and recording capabilities. So we're being watched.
We are being watched from infancy to adulthood. You know, they have the cameras in the bassinets now to watch the babies, and it goes all the way up to extreme circumstances that we've heard, even in the White House, where things are recorded. And so it is relevant for today. So what does it mean for all of us? Well, we don't necessarily have to feel paranoid about it, but we do need to be mindful of our behavior.
Exactly. So as you may have guessed, our invisible tool this week is to act as if you're being watched. There are some specific behaviors we always want to avoid in the workplace, and we're going to take a look at some of those today.
And our development challenge is actually going to encourage us to complete a self-assessment that will judge whether we're guilty of some things that might be inappropriate in the workplace.
And we're excited about our field guide segment. We're going to examine a research study carried out in the 1970s. It was at a wonderful time in a child's life, Halloween. And the researchers wanted to know if kids would steal Halloween candy if they didn't know they were being watched.
It's an interesting study. And we're going to close with what we call final thoughts on learning from people who actually have experienced backlash from doing something inappropriate at work.
So those of you following along in the book, we're in chapter 29. The chapter's called Caught on Camera. If you don't have a copy, scroll down. You can get your own copy of the book. And we do have one other exciting announcement. So many of you longtime viewers know that this little silver seal is a Benjamin Franklin Award that we flew down to Austin to receive for Best New Author in that group. Just this last couple of weeks, the book has been honored with 5 additional awards. We're having them framed to put in the Tero Learning Center, so we're really excited. That's the 2018 Human Relations Indie Book Awards, and we were flattered with 5 of them.
Yeah, that's awards for independent publishers. We're excited.
Exactly. So let's get started with our program.
Well, it's becoming more and more crucial to act as if we're being watched. Actually, a report from the American Management Association showed that almost 80% of major companies monitor their employees' use of email, internet, or phone.
80%. That means the odds are we're being monitored, and that's a huge increase. 20 years ago, that number was just 35%.
Well, a lot of big companies are actually embracing surveillance. For example, Amazon is working on wristbands that would track their fulfillment center employees' hands to monitor their actual performance.
Yeah, and that sounds a little invasive perhaps, but employers are doing the monitoring because of concerns about productivity. They're also monitoring concerns about internet and email usage because inappropriate usage there can actually create a hostile work environment for other people.
So more than a quarter of the companies surveyed said they had fired employees for misusing the office mail, internet, or phone, and 65% had disciplined employees.
So it may sound like horrifying news for employees, but there is good news. There's actually several studies that are reported in the Harvard Business Review that show that surveillance actually helps us improve our job performance.
It can. That's interesting. There was an experiment done with a California police department, and the police who were wearing the body cams were twice as likely to avoid actually using force during an arrest.
That's amazing. And check this one out. This was surveillance of 400 U.S. restaurants. They found by monitoring employee behavior, employee theft dropped by 22%.
Wow.
And productivity and sales went up. So they took a look at check revenue, drink revenue, and tips to the employees, to the serving staff, and all that went up when they had monitoring devices.
Everybody benefited.
Everybody benefited.
So looking at these statistics, it's hard to argue that surveillance doesn't generally improve employee performance. And so with that in mind, let's focus on an invisible tool of the week. It's Act Like You're Being Watched, and it's in Chapter 29, Caught on Camera.
And if you happen to have the book in front of you, we're on page 72.
Well, the idea of acting as if we're being watched is not new. Older generations were told to monitor their behavior so that anything they did, if it ended up on the front page of the newspaper, their family would not be embarrassed. And actually, that idea was enough to keep people's behavior intact.
It really was. And so that threat isn't new, but it's definitely more real today because our behavior is now clearly on display in public settings and is being permanently recorded. And as technology continues to advance, this is going to just increase.
Well, it's not just written about, but it's seen.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go over some specific behaviors that you should make and should try to avoid, actually. An Inc. article listed 25 things to never do at work, and it's by the best-selling author Kevin Daum. We're going to discuss some of those right now. We're going to actually put this as one of our social media posts so you can see all of them later.
So here's the first one. Don't take dramatic phone calls at the office. So your coworkers do not need to hear you fighting with your family members or arguing with your partner. Save those conversations for a more private space.
That can be really uncomfortable
for everybody.
Avoid sending any emails that could be interpreted as offensive. And remember, the work email isn't really private. It belongs to the company. Your boss, your IT department, they can all be monitoring that.
And they are in many cases. Avoid gossiping about coworkers. Not only is that unprofessional, it almost always gets back to the person you're talking about.
It does. And keep intimate details about your personal life to yourself. You might make some of your coworkers actually uncomfortable with your oversharing, and it could make your employer think, or your boss think, you know what, they're really distracted from their work with what's going on in their personal life.
Exactly. So before you say or do something, just ask yourself, what if my leader saw what I was doing? And if the answer is that it might be offensive, just stop.
For this week's development challenge, we're going to ask ourselves, and we're going to ask you during this week to monitor your behavior at work.
So we just went over a few of the behaviors you should never engage in at work. Now it's time to do a little self-assessment and tracking what we may be individually guilty of.
And we're going to encourage you to write these down so you can remember what you're looking for as you go through the week.
So the first one, ask yourself, do you take personal calls at work?
Do you send emails that are personal or maybe potentially offensive?
Yeah. And what about your internet behavior at work? Do you spend time on personal social media? Or are you engaged in non-work related websites? We did some research for the book on the online shopping people do at the office.
It's quite staggering. Do you gossip or say negative things about your colleagues or your supervisor?
Do you overshare about your personal life while at work?
Do you spend a lot of time talking about sensitive issues at work like politics or religion? This is a tough one.
That is a tough one because people are really inclined to talk a lot about it. Mm-hmm. What about swearing? Do you swear in the workplace at all or excessively?
Do you frequently distract your coworkers from their work?
So you can keep track of your answers either mentally or you can write them down. You certainly don't have to share them with anyone. But if you are finding that you're committing some of these behaviors, please know somebody else is probably noticing.
And so this week we challenge you to spend some time monitoring your own behavior and just become conscious to the behaviors that you might want to change and then devote some time to doing that.
And we've made a commitment to do that because during rehearsal this morning before we went live, we were asking ourselves these questions. And most importantly, please be honest with yourself when you're doing self-assessment. These exercises work much better if we're for real.
That's for sure. Now let's talk about this week's field guide. This is so much fun. It's a revealing study that was conducted in Seattle in 1976.
So a group of psychologists studied over 1,000 children, fairly large sample size. The experiment took place on one of the most awesome days of a child's year. It was Halloween.
And they decided that as the children trick-or-treated, they would tempt them to actually steal. And so they put out a bowl of candy and a separate bowl of coins at 27 different houses.
And so here's what happened. When the kids arrived at the door, one of the researchers, an adult, greeted them and gave them the following instructions. You can take one piece of candy, don't touch the bowl of coins, and then she left the room. But of course the researchers are still watching. They're in these houses keeping an eye and monitoring how much of the candy and the coins are being taken.
So the researchers wanted to see two things. One, they wanted to see that if the children would commit the bad behavior when no one was watching them, and this was interesting, when the costumes would hide their identities. I mean, they were superheroes and things that evening.
Exactly. So what do you suppose they found? Well, what they found is that when the children were confident that no one would punish them for stealing, they almost always took some of the coins and more than one piece of candy. And here's a fascinating outcome of this research study. This especially happened when the kids were in large groups.
It tells you something about groupthink.
Yeah.
A researcher involved in the experiment said that the groups of children, if they were in a large group, would even turn over the bowl. They would divide all the candy amongst themselves and all the coins and take off.
But there were some interesting variables among these trick-or-treaters. So some of these young people arrived to the house with a parent. I wonder what impact that had. We'll share that with you. And in some instances, the adult at the door, the researcher, asked the child for their name.
And so if you're a supervising parent, you're going to appreciate this. When the trick-or-treaters were actually with a parent and when they were giving their names or revealing their identities, they were less likely to steal.
So these are kids on Halloween. What does this inform us as adults? Well, not surprisingly, one of the researchers pointed out that when we're not being watched, kids or adults, and we feel like we're not going to get caught, we're all more likely to partake in bad behavior.
And if you think about it, this experiment was done on Halloween in 1976, but it is so relevant, even more relevant today. As we've discussed, our behavior in public spaces is always being monitored due to the continual advances in technology.
And those advances are going to continue. The advances in facial recognition software are really just going to add more to this.
They are. Well, it's time to preview our top social media posts of the week.
And those of you that follow Tero on social media already know we post useful links and content several times every day on interpersonal skills topics. We're going to feature two of them right now.
Well, and we referenced our first post earlier in the program. It's from Inc. magazine's website, and it lists 25 things that we should never do at work. And the author, Kevin Dahm, is an entrepreneur, best-selling author. This is going to be on all Tero social media platforms on Monday. We encourage you to read through it, as we're going to do, and ask yourself, which of these things am I guilty of?
And our second featured post, if you like the Halloween experiment, you're going to definitely want to watch for this one. It's a detailed description of that Halloween candy experiment. We got that from NPR's website. Here's something fascinating. It argues that context, not character, is a greater influencer of our behavior. So it's less about if we're a good person and more about the environment that we're in. It also contains some comments from Scott Fraser, who is one of the researchers. You'll find that on all Tero social media platforms on Wednesday.
Well, at the beginning of our show today, we talked about news bloopers. And remember 5 years ago, I think it was in North Dakota, there was a broadcaster who didn't realize he was on air and in the first few seconds said a curse word. And the clip went viral.
And it was very entertaining for those of us outsiders who watched it, not so much for the anchor who got fired on his first day at work.
Yeah, we can all learn from that incident. And there's other incidences of people who had consequences for their inappropriate behavior. And what it can do is just help remind us and to assume that everything that we do is going to be monitored.
Exactly. And as Deb said earlier, we're not encouraging you to be paranoid and be constantly looking for hidden cameras or to be worried about showing your own personality at work. Just become more conscious and think about how your behaviors might be received.
And when we make an effort to do this, we actually become a better employee, and we're going to be seen as a better employee by our coworkers and the people watching us at work.
Well, thanks for joining us today. If you missed any portion of the program or want to share it with others, you'll find the entire program on Tero's YouTube channel. Tune in again next Monday morning at 9:03 Central Time, where we will explore another tool in your Invisible Toolbox.
And now it's your turn, and we especially invite you to email your ideas for our new studio to ideas@youreinvisiblettoolbox.com. You can also email ideas about what you'd like to see us focus on future shows. If you have team interactions or leadership situations, we'd love to hear from you. Find us on your favorite social media platform. We're out there on all of them. And if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please subscribe today and you'll be alerted to when future shows are going to air. A thank you to Rachel Trainum, our camera person, and Kyle Plummer, our director today.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's a wrap.